Flesh and Blood is way too expensive. This is only true to a certain degree. In my last video we talked about the classic constructed side of Flesh and Blood and the cost of competing in this format and to be good in it also. In this video though, I want to talk with you about the cheap ways on how you can win big tournaments in Flesh and Blood TCG, because there are actually quite a few ways that you can also win cash prizes and win the champion title in this game. Let's dive into it. I think the first thing that we need to talk about is the formats that we are able to play in Flesh and Blood. And like I said, in my last video on this channel, we talked about the expensive format to compete in, Classic Constructed. I think I want to talk with you at first about the expensive formats and then come to the cheap formats. So let's continue on with the expensive ones. Also an expensive format to compete in on those high-level tournaments is the Blitz format, because you also need those staple cards and those legendary equipments to really get to the top 8 in this format, just like in Classic Constructed. Also another format that can be quite expensive to get good at is the Living Legend format, because in this format basically nearly every card is legal in Flesh and Blood, and so you need even more cards compared to Classic Constructed. So let's come to the formats that are actually not that expensive, and then afterwards talk about the tournaments that you can compete in with these cheaper formats. And we will really get into detail with this, coming with examples and also comparing the cash prizes that you can win in those tournaments. Let's get into it. One of those really cheap formats in Flesh and Blood is the Commoner format. And if you want to read yourself about this, just go to the Fab TCG site and go to game, and there is the site formats. So the Commoner format is basically a format where you are only allowed to play those common cards from Flesh and Blood, and those are usually the most expensive ones. There are a few outliers, but you can really get these cards for cheap. And there are tournaments actually, maybe in your local area, but also bigger tournaments like the Battle Hardened, where you can compete in the Commoner format and actually win a big tournament. Yeah, I don't know why you want to win the big tournament. Maybe you want to be the best player, maybe you want to win a title, or you want to win the prizes that are given out at these tournaments. So if you don't have the money for Classic Constructed or Blitz or Living Legend, Commoner would be one thing that you can look out for. But I get that people say Commoner is not really played that often compared to Classic Constructed. That is true, right? So let's look at two other formats that are also widely played and also pretty cheap to compete in. And these are the limited formats in Flesh and Blood, which are my favorite formats to compete in, honestly. The sealed deck and the booster draft. And those are basically formats if you're coming from Magic, maybe from Lorcana or other games where you could play sealed deck and booster draft. You already know these, but if you're a player like me coming from Yu-Gi-Oh, this is very new. So basically that means that you're getting booster packs and you are constructing your deck while you're playing the tournament. And that is something very unique and very skillful in my opinion. And I even talked to some of the most competitive players in Flesh and Blood saying that booster draft maybe even more skillful than the constructed side. But that's not the topic of this video. So let's actually come to those tournaments where you can play those cheaper formats. And that are of course not all of the tournaments that you will see in the next year with the Flesh and Blood World Tour, but some of them, of course. I just want to mention here, though, that a heavy big prize pool is given out by LSS for their tournament season, the World Tour, in the upcoming year. And that is $1.5 million in total. And that is pretty hefty. So if you can get into those tournaments for cheap, like with a Commoner or a limited format, then that might be very interesting, right? If you don't have the money for CC. I really think that you can have a look at this yourself. I don't want to talk about this in much more detail, but what I want to talk with you about are these different levels that we are talking about, right, in the competitive formats. Basically, if you are just starting out, the tier 1 formats, the skirmish events, the armory events, and so on, are the ones that you should look out for. But if you are a more competitive player, maybe you would want to try out the Battle Hardened. And we will specifically talk about those details with recent battle hardens that were going on. And some of them were not with those expensive formats, but with those cheaper formats. So then the next tier would be the national championship and the calling level. And believe it or not, even those cheaper formats are being played at calling levels. And calling is nearly the highest tier tournament that you can play, and there are really big prizes given out. And if you win a calling, you must be a really skillful player. So even if you don't have the money for Classic Constructed, Living Legend or Blitz, playing a draft or a sealed calling might be a thing for you. That's at least the way that I will tackle the next year for Flesh and Blood myself. I don't really want to spend 1,000 euros or even 500 euros on my constructed deck, so I will be forcing and focusing those callings, battle hardens that are being played in the limited formats. Also, the National Championship is a mixed format. I just want to say this here. The National Championship is nothing really that you can, participate in if you don't get the invite for it. But the National Championship, the World Championship, and the Pro Tour are always mixed formats. So you need to be a good draft player and a Classic Constructed player both. You can't only be good in one format competing in these 3 tournaments. Let's actually come to the first example here, guys. And I think the question here is really like, what can I get out of these tournaments when I place at the top level? And just with this recent World Championship, I think we can really get a detail here about it. Let's start with the World Championship, which, as you can see, is of course a really hefty tournament. But when you see it here, the World Championship in Osaka featured $300,000 in cash prizes on top of all of the PTIs, the gold foils, and the Pro Tour Champion prize card. So if you are really good at Classic Constructed and you put in the money to get those cards, you even could get your money back, of course, but I don't think that that should be the main motivator to play those formats. Just wanted to mention it here for the comparison for those other tournaments that we'll talk about. Let's come to the calling, and if you don't know that, at most big tournaments in Flesh and Blood, if you're playing the calling level at least or higher, then you will be able to participate throughout different big tournaments in the weekend. Because if you don't get to win the calling or even don't get to play the next day of the calling, then you can just play the battle harden. And that is, I think, a really very, very nice thing to have in Flesh and Blood. I wasn't really getting used to that in Yu-Gi-Oh! Honestly. Like playing in the YCS and you don't get to the top, it's basically over, right? So let's look at the calling level here. And I think the calling level is very interesting to look at because we have those draft tournaments in the calling level as well. If you are placing at the top level of a calling, I think it is very interesting. And if you come from the point that you don't have enough money for the Classic Constructed side, but maybe you are a really good draft player, then this is very interesting, right? Because placing the first place at the calling can get you even up to $7,500 on top of the champion calling prize card, which is I think around $10,000 to $15,000, and on top of the PTI. And the PTI is also worth a few hundred, even up to $1,000. Keep that in mind. So a total of $30,000 was given out at this calling here at the World Championship. And then they also had the Battle Hardened. The Battle Hardened is the smallest big tournament, so to say, I would say. And even the Battle Hardened has cash prizes on top of the PTIs, the Battle Hardened playmat, and also the gold foil for the first place winner. And if you're placing at the first or the second place, you even get $500, and the total cash prize is given out of $2,000 here at the Battle Hardened level. So let's keep that in mind, guys. We are now coming to, those percentages, and I think looking at this it's very interesting, coming from the last video talking about those heavy priced staples and those legendary cards for Classic Constructed, Blitz, and Living Legend. Now seeing here that you, even if you don't want to compete in Classic Constructed because it's too expensive for you, or you really don't want to spend the money even though you have it, and also Blitz or Living Legend isn't that for you, then you can at least participate in the 30 to 35% of calling main events where the format is limited. So either sealed deck or booster draft. And that's really the way I am tackling Flesh and Blood. Like I said, I really want to focus on those limited formats. I really love it to play booster draft. And of course it depends on the format, but on the booster set, but let's keep the details coming here from the past, right? The Calling Florence was a recent tournament held here in Europe for Flesh and Blood, and it was won by Jacob Clemens. Jacob, congratulations on taking the win on Verdance. Verdance is my favorite Rosetta hero for draft, and I have to say, this isn't really that expensive here. When you're, even if you are looking at the deck list themselves, Jacob wasn't even playing a high value card during his draft, and he was able to take down the event. So that really shows that even though it's not expensive to compete in the first place in this format, it is also not necessary to draft a really expensive card in order to win in this format. And I think that is something that new players can cherish here. And I want to point that out definitely in this video. I want to also talk about the cost here when you want to play a draft at your locals. And I think that is something I do very often, and it doesn't really demand a lot of invest from my side. I play basically for the boosters, which is around €4 each. So for a draft, that's €12 for a tournament. And basically, I played it for the last 3 to 4 months where Rosetta was legal. I even got to win 2 armories, and I also got back my money from opening up those packs and getting a rare card from time to time. I think that is something very interesting. Also, coming to the display price here of around €75, I never bought a box of Rosetta, honestly, to practice for those sealed formats. I only practiced at my locals. I also want to shout out here the next set that is coming up, the Hunted, that we are getting in January. I personally signed up for the Calling in Prague, which cost me €75, and that is a sealed format for the next set, the Hunted. And also there, $20,000 prize pool for the cash prizes on top of all of the prize cards and PTIs and so on is given out. So a very cheap format and tournament to get into, but with a high level if you are really good at these formats. And even for this World Tour, I think, of course, the players who are experienced in draft or in limited and sealed, sorry, I'm mixing up the terms here a little bit. It's of course the sealed format that we are playing, so players that are experienced in sealed having an edge here, but it's an even more even ground, right? Because no one really knows all of the cards, and so even if you're a new player getting lucky, or if you're good at sealed from another game coming to Flesh and Blood, you can have a chance here at this tournament. Also, coming to a recent example here, the Battle Hardened in Stockholm, I want to point out here that it's really different when you're competing in a classic constructed Battle Hardened. So really make sure, if you're a new player and you want to try out your competitive edge in Flesh and Blood, that you're not signing up for a classic constructed event if you don't have the money and you think you will not really want to top this event with those not having those expensive cards. Because looking at the Battle Hardened Stockholm, I'm just so happy to see this picture, honestly. And there are armory decks here that you can buy for cheap, that those heroes placed well in the Battle Hardened here, like the Bolton deck or the KO deck. But keep in mind, you can start playing those classic constructed formats with the armory decks, but you still need to upgrade them quite a lot if you want to compete and get to the top level. And I want to even make this example here and look at the Sir Bolton Breaker of Dawn deck list, second place, piloted by Mika. You have the deck list here, and I also counted it up on Card Market here, including the armory deck. I would need to pay around €470 to get this deck list. So of course you can start with the armory deck, but it's not really that easy to get then the full power of the deck. But in my opinion, I play the KO armory deck, and I only fleshed it up with €100 on top of the armory deck. And I'm happy with that. And I even win games at my local tournaments. I didn't really compete in a calling with my classic constructed deck, but I will also try it out and tell you about it here on the channel. As I was looking at Mika's deck list though, I noticed the price of Enlightened Strike, and that is the point of the last video, right? We will not go into detail about this, but I want to just point it out here that even staples like Enlightened Strike were really creeping up in price from around €35 up to even like €45 here, and you needed those cards for the Bolton deck that Mika piloted. There is luckily though a cheaper alternative here in Europe with the Black Label History Pack 1, and I would just honestly buy this. Like I'm German, right? So I would just buy a German card. But if you want to get the English copy, that's a little bit more expensive here with Welcome to Wraith. Let's get to the next example here though, and that is a Living Legend Battle Hardened, which is also an expensive tournament to get into if you want to get to the top, honestly, because when you look up these deck lists here, they are all running the legendary equipments and the staples, of course. I think, though, when we are looking at the Zen deck of the tournament winner Dan, it is really interesting to see if you're getting into this field that you can reuse. Sorry, this is... no, I wanted to show this next. Sorry, I just clicked it away. That's dumb, but okay. So the very interesting part about this Zen deck here, if you want to compete at those, more expensive side of Flesh and Blood, is that you can use those cards in multiple formats, like Blitz, sometimes, not always, because some heroes are not legal anymore in Blitz, but you could basically use cards throughout those different formats, like Living Legend, Classic Constructed, and Blitz. Because if we are looking at the calling in Portland, also there is 2 Zen players here in the top 8. So if you have the Living Legend or the Classic Constructed date, you can maybe switch those up. That's something I think that is worth mentioning here. I wanted to come to one example here though, and that is the calling Portland. And I have to say, I need to get that other article up again because I wanted to point that out. Yeah, we were talking a lot about this in the comments of my last video that, oh yeah, it's so expensive to get into it and I can't win the tournaments and stuff. And I can get that, guys. But I want to point out really here with Michael Feng on the picture. And also, if we look up the Battle Hardened Hiroshima, where Michael Feng is also on the picture, the winner of that tournament, that also if you get all of those expensive cards, it's not a guarantee that you will get to the top in Flesh and Blood. Flesh and Blood is a really skill and intensively game. And if you're looking at the tournaments and if you're getting into the community, you will really get to know that is a lot of practice to get good at any format, whether it's draft, Classic Constructed, Living Legend, or any other format. Also the Commoner format. Just because the Commoner format is cheap doesn't mean that you will win easily. It is cheap to get into and you can win if you really put in the time and the effort, just like Michael Feng does it with, I think, nearly all of the formats, honestly. And it shows up in him, of course, winning over and over again. Of course, he also travels a lot. That is a thing that maybe not everyone will be able to do, but I think it's really important to mention in this video, guys. And also, I want to shout out here the Taminda. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name right, because a Dash.io list actually came to the top 8 here, piloted by Taminda. And I wanted to look at this deck list too, like with the Battle Hardened deck list for Bolton, because Dash.io is also an Armory deck. So if you're a new player and you want to get cheaply into a Classic Constructed, you can do that just by buying one of those Armory decks, right? I have Bolton here. I don't have Dash.io at the moment, but I will get her in the future. But Dash.io is, like I said, also an Armory deck, so it's easier to get into. But also, if you want to flesh it out and just look at this deck list here, it's also expensive. I counted it up here again on Card Market. It's around 414 euros to get this fleshed out deck. It's not 1,000 though, guys. I think it's really, it's really interesting to look at these two decks here, and they are also not running Command and Conquer. They're running Tunic, so Bolton was running Tunic though, and also you need Crown of Providence, of course, for this Dash.io list, but it's not needed to spend 1,000 euros, right? And in my opinion, that's not only my opinion, if I would be super interested in Classic Constructed, I think I would want, or I would, be, how do you say it in English? I would be fine with spending 400 euros on Classic Constructed. I wouldn't really want to spend it every 6 months again, like you need to do in Yu-Gi-Oh! but I would be fine with this price point. I'm not though, so I'm playing draft at the moment. Let's come actually, but here to this battle hardened Portland. Like I said, if you're running into those calling in events, you also have the chance to participate in the battle hardened if you don't want to play the calling. And the battle hardened in Portland was actually a commoner event. So like I said, we looked at those prices. You could win $500 US, a gold foil envelope, and the PTI. And John Zapata, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing your name as well, right? Was playing Icelander, a really interesting deck in my opinion. And it's also pretty cheap here if you're looking at the deck list. I'm not really sure, maybe Think Below is the most expensive card in here, which is around €1 in Europe, I guess. And all of the other cards are honestly not really that expensive. And even if you're a new player and you just want to go with your locals to a common event, I think that's totally doable. The question is though, of course, that was coming up in my last video as well in the comment section, that if you are having a tournament-based local game store where you can play those formats regularly, or they are just playing Classic Constructed, at least in my locals, we are switching up formats. We are talking about what should we play in the next week. We also want to do it like very friendly for new players, and there's even a schedule done by the organizer that they are making sure that we are switching up the formats so new players can also just come and try out the game. So let's round this up, right? I think the most important part of this video, before I show you the deck list again, is that there are cheap ways that you can win big tournaments in Flesh and Blood for sure. I just showed you those ways in this video. And I also utilize on these cheap ways myself because I'm not confident in buying €1,000 deck because I know I can't put in the time to play that many games to get good at Constructed. I just know that. I'm not that type of player. If you are that type of player, and you don't want to spend the big money, maybe the limited formats are more for you in Flesh and Blood, and maybe you just want to play that side of Flesh and Blood, or you just want to play Commoner. I don't really play Commoner that much, but after making this video, honestly, I'm thinking about maybe getting a Commoner deck together and focusing on those tournaments too, but I'm not sure yet. I really enjoy draft, and that's what I want to get good at in the next year with the Hunted. I also think it's very dependent on the draft set. I heard, the bad stories about the Uprising and Bright Lights times from the top players that I talked to, and I talked to a lot of the high competitive players in Flesh and Blood. And that's why I think it's okay to talk about the expensive side of Flesh and Blood, and that also the Flesh and Blood players are aware of this, but also I think it's fair to say to those players that there are also cheaper ways to compete in those Flesh and Blood tournaments. And let's come to the next, to the last part of the video, which is actually a resource for you to utilize on if you're a new player. If you're an existing player, you already know this, but there is a decklist site on FabTCG, of course, where you can just look up all of the top performing decks of recent tournaments. That's where I also was finding all of those resources that I showed you. So here are the deck lists for the Battle Hardened in Stockholm. Here are also the deck lists for the Battle Hardened in Portland. And if you're watching this in the future, then if you go to that site, there will be the next tournament on here. Also, I want to shout out the events search site here on FabTCG with an advertisement for the next skirmish season, which I think will be Blitz, judging from this photo here with Terra. But you can just type in the format that you want to play. Let's say I want to play, not Classic Constructed, of course, that's way too expensive, right, guys? I want to play Booster Draft. Then I can just say, okay, I want to play it at my Armory. I want to play it at a Battle Hardened or at a Calling. Let's say I want to play it at a Calling, and then I can just say how long I want to travel, and then just basically, also search by date or distance. I think that is a very, very nice resource that you can just search for the tournaments in Flesh and Blood. And also, at last here, I want to just say that the Flesh and Blood World Tour is also pretty huge, I have to say. Not only the prize pool, but also the amount of tournaments that will be held in the next year. And you can just see this by just scrolling down here on this page with the World Tour also available on the Flesh and Blood TCG website. Just in November, in December, There are multiple battle hardens and callings all around the world. In January, there are also 2 callings, 3 battle hardens coming up. In February, there's a calling and the battle harden planned. Road to Nationals, it's coming. 2 more callings. So it just keeps coming, right, guys? And so I think over time there is something to explore for everyone in Flesh and Blood if you really want to play the game and you like it. But I get that there are also ways, that maybe it's so different to get into for the new players, but I would really encourage you, if you like this game and you maybe want to play it the cheaper way, then I hope you could help you with this video, guys. Thank you so much for tuning in today's video, and let's see us in the next video.